It is good to see you. You know, I have spoken in some crazy environments in my life. This matches them. The noise, the sweat, the music. Anyway, I remember one time I spoke to a Rotary Club, and there was a big pool. They put the event at a pool, a swimming pool, an indoor swimming pool. And so there were some people sitting on that side of the swimming pool, some people sitting on that side of the swimming pool, and I was really speaking to the pool itself. This environment is a little better than that. So anyway, thank you for being here. I'm David Gushee. I've been invited to speak on the theme of my book, Defending Democracy from Its Christian Enemies, which, by the way, I'll be doing my book signing right after in the book tent, and so I'll be happy to meet you then and talk about the book, and they also brought some other books. I know that the democracy theme is all over this meeting. There was a session just before on democracy. Everybody's talking about it. I'm a professor. I've written an academic book about democracy, and so I'm actually going to sound maybe a little bit like a professor today, if that's all right. And you might have some notes to take, and I'll test you later on the notes. So I'll say this as I get started. On the progressive side of the spectrum, there's a tremendous amount of worry, even anger and outrage about what's happening on the right side, the conservative side of the spectrum. But I think that the place to start is to try to understand what we're dealing with as rationally as possible. And so I have attempted to offer an analysis in this book. So let me just kind of walk through my analysis, and let's see where that leads. There should be time for a question. Are you ready? Can you hear me fine? Okay. So my book is called Defending Democracy from Its Christian Enemies. The title is probably the most provocative thing about the book. That there could be Christian enemies of democracy is itself a provocative idea. But I think it's an idea that I substantiate in the book. My thesis is that many Christians in the United States and in other countries today and in the past have demonstrated an attraction to what I call, authoritarianism and a reactionary posture in relation to cultural changes. It's the combination of a reactionary posture and authoritarianism that I think is the specific threat to democracy today. My book is a warning about what political scientists call democratic backsliding. If you were raised in church, you know about backsliding, right? Backsliding happens when you were once committed to something and then that commitment erodes. My observation is that Christians, some of whom were once committed to democracy, some of them are having that commitment erode. They're no longer as committed to democracy. They're committed to something different. And so democratic backsliding these days is being aided and abetted by Christians who are abandoning pro-democratic Christian traditions that go back at least 400 years. So my book is about both those pro-democratic traditions and the backsliding away from them on the part of authoritarian and reactionary Christians. Are you with me so far? Does that make sense? This book was motivated, it was my way of processing the entire Trump phenomenon, and especially January 6th. A close examination of January 6th revealed the presence of authoritarian and reactionary Christians in the Capitol and around the Capitol that day, waving Christian flags, praying in Christ's name, believing that the effort to overturn the counting of the ballots was a Christian thing to do. I want to interrogate that. But it wasn't just that. As Donald Trump resorted to more and more anti-democratic tactics when he could not hold on, when he could not hold on to power in a legitimate way, many reactionary Christians went with him every step of the way and remain with him to this day. They went with him all the way to insurrection, which reveals, I think, deeper and longer-term dynamics that we must try to understand. As I tried to understand these dynamics in the U.S., my research trail led me to see the same thing happening in other countries, both historically and today. So one of the things that I'm arguing is that this is not just a U.S. problem. It's a Christian problem in many countries. And if you actually look in countries that are not historically populated by Christians, you can see it among people of other religions as well. It's religious, reactionary authoritarianism. It can be Muslim, Jewish, Christian, Hindu, Buddhist. And so this we must try to understand. In the book, I say that our current democratic crisis reveals the need to revisit the very meaning of democracy. And by the way, isn't it interesting? Have you noticed this? Many people these days are saying, we don't live in a democracy, we live in a republic. That move, I never heard anybody make that argument until about 5 minutes ago. And the reason people are making that move is because they realize that they're vulnerable to the charge of undermining democracy, but also they're beginning to make a different kind of argument about what kind of political system that we have here. So that needs to be understood. But we do live in a democracy, or have lived in a democracy, never a perfect one. But in my definition, a democracy is characterized by the rule of the people under the rule of law. The rule of the people under the rule of law. A democracy exists where the people and their representatives create a constitution under which everyone agrees to live. And then they write the laws that will govern various aspects of the behavior of people, that will enshrine civil rights and civil liberties, that protect individuals and minorities, and really everyone. And that a democracy exists when people elect their own leaders through free, fair, contested elections decided by popular vote and by the peaceful transfer of power. By the way, when you study democratic theory, one thing that's pretty clear is that the Electoral College is in some ways anti-democratic. It's a problem built into our Constitution that has proven its vulnerability time and time again. There are people proposing the abolition of the Electoral College, or at least a substantial revision. I think it's worth considering. Democracy is protected not just by laws, but by norms and customs. Democracy is a culture with practices associated with it. In a democracy, and in democratic practice, you can see best practices that have developed over the 400 or 500 years that modern democracy has been developing. Pro-democracy groups have measures like best practices measures. And if you look at like the website of an organization like Freedom House, they assess every country that claims to be a democracy according to standards of civil liberties and political rights, political processes, and so on. And so what they do on their website, which I use in my book, is they give a grade to every country, a democracy score. And they also assess whether the country is making progress and becoming more democratic, or whether it is backsliding in its democratic practices. How do you think the U.S.'s score has done in the last 5 or so years, right? Yeah. So, like anything that is alive, a democracy can be becoming more healthy or less healthy. And I would say that our democracy, which again was never perfect, is now showing signs of serious ill health. So that it is not hyperbolic to say that our democracy itself is at risk. And so we have to, if we care about democracy, if we are religious believers or not, we have to look to the health of our political system, which I believe most of us took for granted until recent years. We just kind of assumed that every 2 or 4 years there would be a democracy, that people would accept the results of the democracy, that there would be a peaceful transfer of power. All of that cannot be taken for granted anymore. The fragility of our democracy is now visible. And it's not It's not hysteria to say that. I think it is visible. The modern Western democratic tradition has both religious and Enlightenment roots. The religious roots came first. Where democracy really comes from, especially in the Anglo-American tradition, it begins with dissenting religious movements, Jews as well as minority Christian groups, and a small number of Muslims who basically said, we want to live in a society where the government does not establish a religion or harass those who have minority beliefs. So it was religious dissenters who first made the case for what we understand to be the civil liberties protections of democracy. They were the ones who said there needs to be religious liberty. There needs to be freedom of conscience. The government needs to get out of the religion business. And the thing is, though, that the voices of these religious groups have either been weakened or been abandoned in recent days, so that the religious argument for democracy is no longer being made very strongly, which opens the field for the authoritarians to come in and argue for something different. Wow, that music is loud. Should we just kind of like forget this and dance or something? You know, I'm gonna try here, okay? You still with me? What? I don't think I can't make that happen right now, but I'll just be even more compelling than I've already been, okay? Oh yeah, here we go. No wonder everybody shouts from this platform. All right. Okay, thanks. So, Western democracy was supported by religious people when it was born. It was especially supported by religious minorities. The people who had the hardest time getting their minds around democracy were the religious majorities, like Catholics in France, or the Anglicans in England, or the Lutherans in Germany. Why? Because it's kind of nice to be a majority and have the government enforce your religion. So the genius of the U.S. system from its beginning was the First Amendment model, which said the government will not be hostile to religion, but it will also not establish a religion. There will be freedom of religion and freedom from religion. The government will get out of the religion business. Part of what is happening among authoritarian, reactionary Christians today is they are wanting to revisit that arrangement. They, kind of like Lutherans in Germany in 1600 or Catholics in France in 1800 or whatever, they would like a majoritarian imposition of the majority's religion. And you actually have elected officials saying, it's time to do away with the First Amendment. It's time to write Jesus into the Constitution. It's time to elect officials who will overturn the supposed separation of church and state, which they sometimes argue never really was our system. So partly what we have is a war within American religion, notably Christianity, between those who remember the dissenters who supported the way we organize our democracy here, and the majoritarians who were either defeated or gradually came to recognize that, well, I can be a majority in one state today, but if I move to a different state, I might be a minority, and then I might have my rights suppressed. So maybe the best situation is freedom of religion and separation of church and state. The Enlightenment tradition contributed the idea that democracy or government should not flow from the top down, but it should flow from the people up. That we are the ones who create a government and give that government certain powers to protect our rights and to organize society. This was a tremendous achievement. So it was the combination of like John Locke and the early Baptists and the early Puritans and the Jews and the Quakers and the Muslims and so on saying, let's build a new kind of government, a democracy organized federally with these different states with freedom of religion, not hostility to religion, but where we understand that the people are the source and sovereign of government, and government is going to get out of the religion business. And I would say we have had that system since basically 1789. It's quite a heritage that used to be looked at by people around the world as an inspiration. And it is that heritage that is directly being challenged today for a variety of reasons. Can I just say, if we are on the brink of a new Caesar, supported by conservative Christians, let us remember why people like the Caesars were rejected. The centralization of power in the hands of monarchs, Caesars, emperors, dictators, and oligarchs does not work well for anybody other than the ruling elite, the ruling clique, or the ruling person. What an achievement it was for the people gradually to shuck off, to slough off tyranny, and to establish democracy. But these days, there is a significant Christian support for something like a Christian Caesar. In fact, there are actually books where people on the right are arguing for a new kind of Caesarism, and Donald Trump is the main tribune of that hope. So, in all the countries that I've studied, I've looked at Russia under Putin, Hungary under Orban, Brazil under Bolsonaro, Poland under the Law and Justice Party, and the U.S. under Trump. And then I look back to Germany in the pre-Nazi era and France in the 19th and early 20th century. What they all have in common is what I call ultra-strong negative reaction by religious traditionalists who feel that they are losing control over their society. Okay? So let's call it authoritarian, reactionary Christian politics. It's a ferocious negative reaction on the part of what was once, or maybe still is, a religious majority, a negative reaction to cultural changes that they believe violate their religious and moral traditions and weaken their social power. So this could be the Orthodox Church in Russia. It could be the Catholic Church in Poland or France, or evangelicals and Catholics in the U.S. and Brazil. This can also happen in other countries, like in India, the kind of Hindu-oriented government of Modi, or in Turkey under Erdogan, the Muslim, or the resurgent Islamist kind of vision there. What these all have in common is something like this. This country belongs to us. Interlopers are challenging our social dominance. There's too many people who are not like us overall, and there's too many people who are not like us who are gaining power. We want to reestablish our dominant position in the society, and we want to reverse legal changes that allow equal rights or any rights to people of other religious and sometimes racial, ethnic, and other kinds of backgrounds. I notice, I talk about in the book, dynamic that Michael Walzer calls secular revolution, religious counter-revolution. And I think that language is very helpful because many folks on the right are explicitly using the language of religious counter-revolution. And here I want us to be honest about all of what the right is reacting to. You know, I've lived since 1962, which is actually a pretty good year to date the social changes that have most unhinged the mind of conservative America. 1962 was the Engel versus Vitale Supreme Court decision, which banned school-sponsored prayer. If you're old enough, do you remember that was a really, really big deal? They've taken God out of the schools. Remember that? Then in 1963, there was the Schempp decision, which banned the public school from teaching the Bible. They've taken the Bible out of the schools. Have you noticed that in Oklahoma, there's an education secretary attempting to reverse this directly, right? So that was 62 and 63. In 1965, there was the Immigration and Naturalization Act. That opened immigration to a much wider population so that many people from the global south came to the U.S. in numbers that had not been seen before. So that in 1965, 84% of the U.S. population was non-Hispanic white. In 2015, that number was 62%. That 50-year demographic change is definitely part of what is creating this negative reaction. Robbie Jones calls it the end of white Christian America. It's a combination of religious diversity, but also racial demographic change. And it's not just the makeup of the population, but it's also the fact that some of these non-white, non-Christian folks end up in positions of power, which further unhinges the people who feel like this country belongs to us. Okay, so I've mentioned Supreme Court decisions, immigration, the civil rights movement with the laws of 64 and 65, the sexual revolution, the feminist movement, the gay rights movement. What am I missing? The Roe v. Wade decision of the Supreme Court in 1973. Picture a population that considers everything that has happened since 1962 along these lines to be really, really bad news. A complete blanket negativism. Make America great again for some people means take us back to 1953. Actually, the first major Supreme Court decision that got this going was Brown versus Board in 1954. So I think we're looking at a 70-year counter-reaction that has gotten all tangled up with religion and race and social power and migration and sex and gender roles into one big sorting of the population along left-right lines. I've been around long enough to know that I've watched conservative Christians attempt to reverse these changes through everything they could think of to do. And if you remember being in churches where the goal was to evangelize everyone in the neighborhood and get them to come back to the one true faith, right? So the evangelism strategy, did it work? It did not work. Or maybe if we can just set up Christian schools and get everybody educated the right way, but that didn't work. Or have really great youth groups or college ministries or write books or make great movies. You know, the great Christian movies that change the culture, right? I'm being sarcastic there, okay, right? Or the great music that was going to win the hearts of the society. My diagnosis is that the conservative Christian community has been trying to reverse unwanted cultural changes since at least the 60s. They tried cultural strategies, they tried evangelistic strategies, they tried educational strategies. They even tried the political strategy of getting in a partnership with the Republican Party. That was called the New Christian Right. And do you remember that was the late 70s. The main figures were people like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson. And the first president who was elected with that partnership was Ronald Reagan. And that was 1980. That was 44 years ago. But here's what I know about conservative Christians. Whether it was Ronald Reagan or George Bush Sr. or George Bush Jr. or other politicians, they were not satisfied that they got the political and cultural changes that they wanted. And I would say the election and re-election of Barack Obama further sent this population kind of around the bend. And then the Obergefell gay marriage decision in 2015. And so along comes the 2016 election, and you have a population that is ready for an avatar of cultural resentment. Who will best articulate our rage at everything that has changed since 1962? Here's a guy, Donald Trump. Remember, there were 17 people who ran for president on the Republican side in 2016. And they picked Donald J. Trump. And I think the best way to think about it is he was the antithesis of Obama in every way. And so, but by allowing somebody of authoritarian impulses who took his inspiration from people like Putin and Orban and Bolsonaro and so on, authoritarianism was introduced into the body politic in a way that we had not seen, at least in living memory. And as Trump worsened in his authoritarianism, religious kind of frenzy got associated with it. a cosmic battle between good and evil. I mean, do you know people, you may know, I know some people who believe that any victory by any Democrat anywhere is a victory of Satan? A victory of Satan. If you're in a cosmic battle of good versus evil, what do we care about democratic niceties? All you got to do is win. I would say that democracy is challenged when everybody, especially challenged when everybody looks at every election as a battle of good versus evil. We are tearing apart. But I would say it's more likely on the Republican side than on the Democratic side for this to be understood as a battle of God versus Satan, good versus evil. And you know, what's a little bit of fiddling with the democratic process if it's about God versus Satan and good versus evil? So in the book, I plead with my fellow Christians to remember why once upon a time we were for democracy, why we believed in religious liberty, why we believed in separation of church and state, to understand that love of neighbor can't just mean love of the neighbors who are like us, who believe like us, who look like us, whose lives resemble ours. A vision of an inclusive society in which everybody's rights are respected. I'm also saying, don't interpret everything that has happened since 1962 as a negative thing. Perhaps a lot of what has happened has been a victory for humanity, for human rights, for the dignity of people who've been mistreated. For, if you don't see it for you, maybe it's for your child or for your aunt or uncle or your dad or your sister or your friend. A society that is less oppressive of religious and gender and sexual and racial and political minorities is a better society, a fairer society, a more godly society. So I'm begging Christians not to sacrifice the pro-democratic, pro-human rights, pro-sacredness of all life, traditions that go back hundreds of years, for a mess of Trumpist authoritarianism. And the fact of the matter is that I'd say there's a sliver of Christians who are reachable and a lot of Christians who are no longer reachable. And that is why Trump poses the threat that he does. But even if he were gone tomorrow, this authoritarian, reactionary Christian subculture goes far beyond him. In homes, in Christian schools, in many churches, people are being taught a vision of mortal combat in which we need to take back this society by any means necessary. If we can win at the ballot box, great. If we can't, we might have to consider other means. So I want to say, and I'll close this way, it is a tremendous tragedy for me as a Christian minister and a Christian ethicist to see how easily Christian majorities or large minorities can forget everything we ever once knew about the rights of minorities, about civil liberties, about the rule of law, about the need to love all of our neighbors as ourselves. And the fact that this is an international movement must mean that there's a kind of authoritarian seed in the Christian tradition, or you might say it's in the DNA and it's always there to be activated. I don't think that means we have to reject Christianity, though some do because of this, but I do think we have to call on Christianity's better resources. So I wrote a footnote to my lecture here. In July 2024, how is it looking? It's not looking very good. If the Republicans sweep in November, there will be lots of ultra-conservative Christian ideologues who will staff the new government and who will attempt to implement things like what is happening in Oklahoma, all over the country, essentially probably use the Supreme Court, if possible, quite possible, to reverse the 1962 and 1963 Supreme Court decisions. Maybe even to officially establish a version of Christianity as the religion of the land. the response of the right to how they look at society is an authoritarian Christian takeover of the government. And Trump is the avatar of that vision. I hope that he can be defeated, but I hope we know what we're dealing with. But really, mainly as a Christian minister, I want to apologize and lament that this would not be possible were it not for the Christians of this country. And maybe, if we can get organized, we can help prevent it from happening. Thank you very much. Huh? Yeah. So that was my quick and dirty version of my book. So, questions? Happy to fill out more. Yeah.
In Project 2025, one of the key elements of that is to create nationally a school voucher program focused specifically on private schools. I'd like to hear your comments.
It's very clear that how children are educated is at the heart of authoritarian reactionary Christianity in every country that I've studied. And there's a variety of strategies that could be and are undertaken to get the result that people want. Clearly on the right, the public school system, under the leadership, for example, of the National Education Association and the mainstream school administrators, is understood to be an enemy. Okay, so what do? If that enemy cannot be defeated, one thing you can do is withdraw your kids to homeschooling or Christian schools, right? So that's a withdrawal strategy, which has been widely adopted. The number of kids in homeschool and Christian school are massive. I don't know what the number is, but it's at least 10%, I think. And there is no government regulation of that curriculum. And so there's a lot of stuff that happens in there, including, I wrote in my book about widely used Bob Jones University Christian school curriculum that says that the proper political system that we should be striving for is a Christian constitutional republic. And that if the law does not reflect the law of God, it is not legitimate, as understood there. Okay, so one strategy is withdrawal if you can't beat the system. Another strategy is vouchers for private schools so that, in essence, the whole tax system can be used to send kids with funding to private schools. But the most ambitious strategy of all is to make the public schools maybe what they used to be in like 1958 in Oklahoma. Essentially, the majority culture prevails. And so you have Christian Bible reading and Christian prayer sponsored by the teachers and the principals, and that is also being attempted. So that's the way to think about it. Homeschooling and private schooling is a withdrawal option. Vouchers is a kind of a bypass the public schools option. But overturning the understanding of what the limits are in the public school, that's the most ambitious strategy of all. And with this particular Supreme Court, I think it will be possible to make an awful lot of progress with that strategy. In fact, it already has to some extent. Yep.
Hi, I'm the enemy. I'm coming off of 37 years of public school teaching as an elementary counselor.
We love you. You are not the enemy.
You're my people, for sure. So first, I wanted to thank you for your phrase, avatar of cultural resentment. Because of the popular media that I consume, it helps me emotionally regulate a little bit around this. I have a lot of anxiety.
Yeah.
Recently, I've been reading about Project 2021.
25?
25.
Right. Mm-hmm.
The way I understand it is it's a really specific, detailed plan to do a lot of the things that you're talking about. And I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about that and share what you know so that we can be a little better informed. It's long. It's almost 1,000 pages. It's got a really pithy table of contents. If you heard Brian McLaren the other day, read the table. It'll get you started.
Yeah. Trump is trying to distance himself from that Project 2025 because he knows he's vulnerable on it. What I know about it is partly it is a collection of like names and resumes, and they're trying to build a staff that can populate not just the political appointees, but the idea would be to clear out a lot of the civil servants in the upper level of the civil service at the federal level, and then replace them with ideologues, Trumpist ideologues. And this is a matter of personal concern to me. I grew up in Northern Virginia. My father was an upper-level civil service person. Everybody we knew seemed to be in that environment. The professionalism of the civil service over many decades, crossing Republican and Democratic lines, is part of what helped our country to be a fairly well-run country for a long time. If that were to be gutted, we'd have not only the maladministration of a lot of government agencies, but also, I think a decline in the operation of everything, right? But also the misuse of government power to advance Trumpist goals. So don't overlook the goals related to the civil service, the staffing, the people who are wanting to be placed in these positions, and I think that the Christian/traditionalist values agenda is very strong in 2025, in the Project 2025, and the idea is to turn the power of the federal government into unofficially or officially establishing traditionalist conservative Christianity as kind of like the ruling ethos of the society, and setting aside those limits that have prevented that from happening. And they do have the kind of Supreme Court that might make legal challenges fail in relation to those strategies. I have not read the document yet. Those are things that I've heard about it in the reporting. Yeah. Okay, so the statement was Heather Cox Richardson is doing a forum, I guess, on Facebook on Monday night. Okay. Yeah.
I'm a minister in a mainline church where we do have Republicans and Democrats in the congregation. God forbid if the avatar of cultural resentment wins the next election and we have to live through an era of Christian authoritarianism. Yeah. What would be your advice to ministers like myself or other Christian leaders?
One of the things that is really scary right now is what's been called the Great Sort, the sorting of our population into, for lack of a better term, red and blue. And so churches like yours, sir, where they can literally be called purple churches, where you might see a Biden bumper sticker on a car next to a Trump bumper sticker on a car. One of the things to be said about that is it's almost a miracle that such churches even exist. And holding communities together where people vote differently is not a small achievement in 2024 America. But that also comes immediately into tension with maybe the ministers, if the minister feels the sense of, I really need to speak out on some issues. So if in the run-up to the election, or if, say, Trump is elected and let's say he starts trying to round up 15 million people, and you say, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to speak to this, the more forthrightly and directly one addresses issues that divide like that, the less likely that the purple will remain. So every minister who is trying to keep a purple church together is constantly navigating that. When am I called to speak? When am I called to really be trying to just keep the community together? The more polarizing a political figure, the harder it is to keep people together in community. So I guess I would have to say you have to hold loosely, be grateful for the community that exists now, be ready for the possibility that what you feel called to say may threaten the unity of that community.
Yeah. Yes. The corporate takeover that we talked about a little bit in 1940, 2009 when they were trying to kill the New Deal and Billy Graham rose to power with William Randolph Hearst behind him. How did that, is it just tax breaks that the corporate world is looking at now? Why are they so complicit in this? Is they looking at the sea change, or are they looking at save my ass, save my job?
Yeah. The economic dimension of this story is a little bit complicated. It's definitely true that in the rise of conservative evangelicalism in the U.S., from the progressive era forward, so 120 years by now, there was a tendency for fundamentalist and conservative Christians to be anti-social reforms, anti-progressive movement, anti-New Deal, anti-Great Society. And there are a number of really good books that are about, for example, how big oil went Republican and conservative evangelical, and the corporate sector, people like Howard Pugh and the people who funded a lot of the big seminaries like Moody. So there's been a conscious effort to cultivate the corporate sector for evangelicalism with a lot of success. Part of what has frustrated the authoritarian reactionary Christians is that the corporate sector of our more recent time has tended to be more interested in diversity and inclusion, more socially aware, environmental justice, concern about climate change. In other words, from the conservative perspective, they've gone woke. And so my understanding is that Trump at this point does not have a massive amount of support from the corporate sector. Not from the new tech side, though there is some, and not from the old Main Street either. This is really more a movement of cultural resentment, but what he was able to feed them in 2017 was tax cuts. And tax cuts are a tried and true strategy for having wealthy people be supportive of you. Whether that would be promised again in 2025, I'm not seeing as much of that. So I would say that even the financial piece, the economic piece, is not as strong as the religious, cultural, moral piece that has never been stronger than it is now. Yeah.
I wanted to ask, I think I've asked this before, but I'm curious where you are right now. Sorry? Okay. Whether the use do you use fascism in the book? Why not? If not, why not? To me, it certainly seems as though the shoe fits, and it seems advisable to, like, if it's accurate, then that would be a helpful thing to know, because there is a history of resistance that could be studied in aid of that. And if not, it would be good to not choose the wrong set of resistances and tactics in resistance.
I'm trying to find my discussion of fascism. Where is it? Anyway, I do talk about fascism in the book, and I look at theorists of fascism. I would say that in some ways the shoe fits. In other ways, it hasn't developed or metastasized to that extent yet, but it always has the potential. Among the things that theorists of fascism point out is that essentially fascist strategy is to mobilize a population around a kind of a mythic vision of the past, targeting people who are seen as a threat to that continuing, or the people who made it end, and lifting up one person or party as national savior and redefining truth according to what that person says truth is. So there are definitely fascistic elements that we're looking at here. And can I also say that in every country that I have studied, anti-LGBTQ policy and rhetoric and demagoguery is part of the strategy. because it's a way of picking a vulnerable and relatively small population to say, it's their fault. Now, what I'm noticing right now with Trump is his scapegoat target right at this moment appears to be immigrants, not LGBTQ people at this moment, though that can always turn. And other politicians can go that way in the wake of such a movement, right? But the way he used anti-immigrant rhetoric in that debate struck me. I described it in an article as cruel and dangerous. Okay? So that I think is what I'm especially paying attention to. And yes, in the history of fascism, targeting a minority population by supposed race and saying if we could just do something about them, we would have the golden days, that is a fascist strategy. So let's just say at least we're dealing with fascist adjacent, if not incipient fascism. I tend to try to come up with language that invites people into the conversation, at least at first. Fascist tends to, okay, so now we're playing the Hitler card and that's the end of it, right? But I think the section in the book that talks about fascism is I'd say it's relevant and it does address it. Yeah, maybe we have time for one more question? Okay.
Can we learn anything from the recent French election?
From the recent French election, well, I don't even understand how their electoral system works. That you could have a vote on one Sunday, and then people see it's almost like a straw poll, and then you could see, I guess we better do some reconfiguring so that we don't have the worst possible outcome. You know, part of having such an old democracy with such rigidity and ineffectiveness right now is we're not able to make reforms. We're stuck with a system that isn't working very well. I also want to say, look at the British election. I put this on Facebook. They managed to pull off an election in 6 weeks with results that were reported overnight, universally accepted, and a prime minister installed in one day. Compare that to our mess, right? So the French turned away from the right so that at least they are not the primary group. But if you look at the distribution, they're left, center, and right relatively evenly distributed, kind of boom, boom, boom. They're going to have a very great difficulty forming a government. All it's not hunky-dory in France, but it is better than it looked like it was going to be like 3 weeks ago. Yes, so that's what I would say. Even, for example, the fact that we have an election in November and an installation in late January, why do we need 2.5 months? We now know how much trouble can happen in those 2.5 months. The sense that we have a kind of a tottering old system that we can't get reformed because of our polarization is a very real problem. Maybe I'll end with this. Our democracy is weakening not just because there are bad actors, but also because there are some structural flaws in our democracy itself. In a well-run country, smart representatives would solve these problems and we'd be able to do better. But we're not doing that, which leaves us vulnerable. So, kind of nerdy, wonky reform of our constitutional, some of the provisions of how we do elections and stuff, and even how the Senate is run, like the filibuster and stuff, all of this is relevant. God help us. And may we be representatives of something other than authoritarian, reactionary Christianity. Thank you all very much.